Hello and welcome to the final episode of the Cailleach's Cave. I have my last story for you today. And it starts in a small village in the Highlands, many centuries ago, and around this time in the lunar cycle, and it was the night of Samhuinn that was fast approaching. The village folk were preparing for the darker half of the year, stockpiling food and preserving berries and meats, and tanning hide for warmth. Between the collection of wooden huts and shelters, smoke hung in the air, and the smaller children of the village chased each other in circles, disappearing behind wool hangings and throwing handfuls of autumn leaves at each other. The older children in the village were hard at work making masks and costumes for the village festival on Samhain night, a time when spirits and fae walked freely in our world. A disguise allowed humans to wander among them, and besides, it was a whole lot of fun to leap about in a mask and frighten your younger siblings. It was also a time for the village folk to honour their ancestors, tell stories, and relight their home fires from the single bonfire that would be lit ceremonially at the heart of the village. In this village lived a young lass by the name of Morag. Morag was a quiet girl, and was not making a costume with the other girls her age, but was spending most of her time alone in her father's carving shed. He was an expert woodworker, and carved beautiful creatures out of different types of wood. He blackened them with fire and polished them with tree sap, or painted them with different colours of clay or berries. Morag had a favourite wee animal that he had made for her 14th birthday last year, a little black fox with tiny pieces of amber for eyes. She spent most of her daylight hours watching her father work and trying to learn his craft. Morag's mother had been dead many years. She'd been a healer like her mother before her, and had passed on during a particularly bad sickness that swept through the village when Morag was only 5. Morag had no interest in learning to be a healer if it meant that you were just as vulnerable to sickness as those you tried to heal. She was, however, very interested in her paternal grandmother, who was the village storyteller. On Samhain night, she would stand at the front of the great bonfire, with the village gathered close, hunched over and holding a great big staff adorned with antlers, for effect, of course, and spirited the listeners away with her tales of fairies and the other world. Morag had tried to learn as many stories as she could from her grandmother, but found that when she tried to practice telling them back to her father, she got all the details all muddled up, and he ended up laughing and tickling her until she remembered. The night of Samhain came, and Morag put on the mask her father had made for her, from thin sheets of birch bark, painted pale grey with river clay, with holes for eyes and a small carved beak. She wore a white woolen cloak, with long white wool locks adorned about her shoulders. Altogether it completed the look of a rather large and awkward barn owl. Her father, wearing a pair of antlers and a giant deer hide, put out the fire in their hut, as was customary, and Morag flapped silently out to join the little crowd of villagers with their strange and eerie masks, all silently and solemnly walking together to the central bonfire. The fire was as tall as a birch sapling, and gave off such immense heat that many folk took off their animal skins or woolen cloaks and sat on them, settling in to listen. Morag sat at her father's feet, rather than with the other children who crowded together at the front, leaning into the stories wide-eyed with mouths agape. At the very front, Morag's grandmother stood, a dark shape silhouetted by the fire. She wore an enormous brown wool shawl, and as she lifted her head to start, Morag gasped at the beautifully crafted feathery eagle-owl mask that she wore. The stories began and went late into the night. Some of the smaller children fell asleep at the cosy heat of the fire, and the stories became darker and more mysterious. Morag too became a little sleepy, but in the wood smoke-filled haze, she suddenly realised that she could see something at the edges of the shadows, in the dark corners of the village that the firelight didn't quite touch. She narrowed her eyes behind her mask to blot out some of the light, and saw it again. Pale white wisps of figures gathered together between the huts and houses, watching and listening, but unseen by anyone else. Morag thought to herself dreamily that it must be the spirits of the village ancestors of which her grandmother spoke so animatedly in her stories, visible now that the veil between the worlds was down. There were also other figures in the shadows, strange creatures and unearthly shapes that Morag couldn't quite see solidly in her hazy vision. She watched them silently until the stories were over, and mead was passed among the villagers, and the laughter grew and the drums began. Morag sat and watched as the pale figures gathered in close as they dared to listen to the music and the revelry. Morag's eyes widened as she saw the pale creatures venture further in and dance among her kin, in circles around the fire. A girl about her age, wearing a troll mask, spun around, dancing and laughing, and, unseen, a pale figure, small and squat with giant ears, capered around her, mimicking the girl's dance. Morag laughed out loud, and her voice was carried away into the throng. After the dancing was over, and the villagers gathered over the slowly dying fire to carry home their little flames, from which they would light each fire in their home, Morag sat in the same spot, still watching the spirits and the fairies that roamed around her village. Her father raised an eyebrow to her, and asked if it was bedtime, but Morag said she wanted to stay a little while longer by the fire. He told her to be careful, and with a knowing look headed home. After all the villagers had toddled off home to bed, Morag still sat by the fire, entranced to its care, as the last person still awake. Now that the heart of the village was quiet once more, the pale figures ventured out of the shadows and gathered around the fire, attracted to its warmth. The spirits of the village folk became clearer to her eyes, and she saw men and women and children that had passed on in her lifetime, and some that she didn't recognise. Some cast their eyes over her, but they seemed mostly interested in the hot, bright flames. Fairies and other creatures danced about still, as though the drums still played. Suddenly the circle of figures parted, and as Morag watched from the other side of the circle of spirits, a tall figure of a cloaked woman glided forwards and held a central position opposite Morag. Morag watched entranced as the woman lifted her arms, and her face became clearer. She gasped when she realised that the woman wore a barn owl mask, just like the one Morag wore. And for a second the dark, shadowy eyes beneath each mask connected. Morag knew in that moment that it was the spirit of her mother. She knew that it was a privilege to be the only person still alive, witnessing this strange ritual of those who dwelled in the other world, and stayed exactly where she was, silently watching. The spirit of her mother began to chant in a low voice, Anian, Avaheth, Ahanaveth. Then she removed her owl mask, and Morag saw with a tug at her heart the face of her mother, wise and beautiful, and smiling gently at the circle of spirits. Then she bent and gathered ash from the edges of the fire, and rubbed it over her pale, ghostly arms. Next she picked up handfuls of wet earth, and marked out lines down her face. Lastly, she dug a hand into a pouch at her waist, and out came a fistful of what looked like blackberries, with which she drew a central line down the middle of her forehead, nose, and chin. Her eyes blazed for a moment with the reflection of the dying fire, and then she opened her arms and looked straight at Morag, inviting her into the circle of spirits. Morag walked forward, gliding as though she too were a spirit, and took up a place between a very old woman, with pale, wrinkled hands and kind eyes, and a young girl about her age. The two smiled at her, and their translucent bodies came close to hers, but she did not touch her. Morag stared across the fire at the spirit of her mother, who raised her arms to the sky, and though she did not move her mouth, Morag felt her words echo heavily inside her head. Daughter, mother, grandmother, always we walk with you, my child, and always the wheel turns. Morag's eyes fell to the old woman who stood at her side, and knew that she was her grandmother. In that moment, Morag knew that she was held by the weight of these lives that had lived out under the same stars that she and her father gazed at, night after night, and that her ancestors were with her, whatever path that she chose, and wherever she went in her life. Her mother's spirit smiled once more at Morag, and then the circle of spirits began to dance, and strange fairies joined in, and Morag danced with them too until dawn. When the first bluish tint that crept upon the horizon, Morag began to see that the spirits were fading away, their pale ghostly forms lingering for a second, and then becoming indistinguishable from the wood smoke that hung above the remains of the fire. Finally, when the last recognisable glimpse of her mother's face disappeared, Morag sat down by the embers of the fire and smiled to herself, feeling blessed to have witnessed such a thing in her lifetime, and dreamily drew a spiral in the embers of the fire with a stick, carving it into the glowing orange coal over and over until the embers had become ash, and she herself had drifted off to sleep as dawn took over the sky. Thank you.